Hi everybody, we have another task to look at here, so let's jump straight into it. You work from home and have a problem with a piece of equipment that you use for your job. Write a letter to the shop or company which supplied the equipment, and in your letter describe the problem with the equipment, explain how this problem is affecting your work, and say what you want the shop or manager to do. So let's go through the usual process here. We'll talk about keywords, we'll talk about the tone, and we'll talk about the purpose. So let's start with the keywords. First of all, we work from home. It's important, we'll need to acknowledge that in our letter. It might influence the content. We have a problem with a piece of equipment that you use for your job. So it's related to your work. And you bought it from a store, so we need to write a letter to the shop or company which supplied that piece of equipment. So when we write to this shop or company, we need to describe the problem with that equipment, explain how the problem is affecting the work, so explain how the problem affects your job specifically, and then we can say what do we want the shop or the manager of the shop to do. So we have our keywords there. I don't think there's anything too challenging behind that, but when it comes to the purpose, we may need to be a little bit more careful. But first of all, let's think about the tone. Hopefully, well, we know which tone we're in. We're in the formal tone, but hopefully you can see why it should be a formal tone adopted here. It's because we're writing to a company. We may not be writing to a colleague or our manager, but we're writing in a professional capacity because we're writing to someone that we don't know, and we're writing to them in a professional capacity. So it's a formal tone. And the trickier thing here might be to identify the purpose, and you may be inclined to say that this is a complaint letter. And although there may be an element of a complaint here, do notice that the word complain, the verb complain, or any synonym like it, is not presented in the task. So I'm not sure that I would go with the verb complain. I'm not sure I would call it a complaint letter. Instead, I would call it a providing of information letter. We're just providing information, we're explaining something. There may be some complaints-ish language that we use, but on the whole, this is more a case of providing information and requesting help as well. It's mostly providing information, but also requesting help, and there may be a slight element of a complaint, or at least there might be a slight element that a complaint might follow if the issue isn't sorted. But do be careful to give some consideration to the purpose. Don't immediately jump on your first impression. You want to give it a little bit of thought before you begin, because otherwise you might begin the letter by saying, "Dear Sir or Madam, I am writing to complain about," but that is not what you're being asked to do, and that's an incredibly important sentence, that first one, so that's why it's so important. Before we get there, of course, we need to think about a plan, so let's do that here. P2, P3, and P4, and because we're in a formal letter here, the first paragraph, it might be there, it might not be there, it depends how we go about it. I think it probably will be a separate first paragraph, so we'll go into P2 here to describe the problem. Let's imagine, so I'm actually going to look at this from a very personal experience. I have taught English online quite a lot, as I'm sure you're aware. So I have worked from home, I do work from home, and although I don't teach much online anymore on Skype, I used to, and I can imagine, or I used to have, I have experience of having problems with particular equipment in the past, specifically a microphone. So I'm going to use my own personal experience here to give me some ideas, and I can imagine that we have an issue with a microphone, and some issues that I've had with microphones in the past is that they have been poor quality. That could be one idea. I'm going to use the idea of it cutting out, so it doesn't always pick up the voice. It seems to cut out at random intervals. We need to be a little bit more precise here. We're going to describe the problem. We need to give a little bit of detail. We could say it cut out. How often does it cut out? We could say, like I said, their random intervals is good. Maybe you could think about how often they last, the duration of the cutouts, but I'll think of that when I get there. It's good to just write down any nice vocabulary that comes to mind so that you don't lose it later. So random intervals is a nice collocation that you could use. And then we can move on to explaining how the problem is affecting our work. And this is where we need to come in and talk about the job that we have. So like I said, say I'm an online English teacher. And why is that important then? Let's say you want to basically, well, we could say that we can imagine that they understand how important it is. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to think about how important a functioning microphone is. But maybe again we'll just use some nice vocabulary, something like compromising quality of my work, quality of the lessons. Again, that paragraph should mostly just write itself. I don't think we need to put down too many ideas. So maybe there, just putting down some vocabulary so that we can use it later is more important. And then we're going to finish with the final paragraph there. Say what you want the shop or the manager of the shop to do. And here is where we have to be a little bit more careful with the purpose. So we've talked about providing information. Now this more is requesting help. Again, I don't see this as a complaint letter, so it looks like we're asking for help to solve the issue. So first of all, we could ask if it's a defect. Is the unit defective? Maybe it's just one. So maybe a sort of question here, or we could even turn it into a conditional. If the item is defective, then perhaps we could have a refund in that case. Again, it's not a complaint, it's just makes sense to ask for a refund if it's not working. But then maybe it's not defective, maybe we've set it up wrong, so therefore we might want to ask for guidance on how to solve the problem. And as always, we've just got a couple of points for each of the main paragraphs. That should be plenty, some nice language there, so we can move into the letter itself. So let's go into that, and I would imagine here in this case that I don't know the name of the manager, so you might use the name of the company. I'm just going to go with dear sir or madam and use that comma as always, couple of spaces as always, and then I have that first purpose sentence, and it's very important that we look at that purpose here, providing information about something, not complaining. A nice way to open that is to, I am writing to draw your attention to, and although it's not a complaint letter, it clearly is a problem, like the task says. So we can say, draw your attention to a problem, or paraphrasing, to an issue. And then we have to explain a little bit of what the issue is. I have been experiencing, notice the grammar I'm using here, it's the present perfect continuous, so it started in the past, it's continuing all the way up to the present, and it's probably going to carry on in the future. An issue I have been experiencing with, now remember, with a formal letter, we should try to be as detailed as possible, particularly in that opening paragraph, opening line. So let's be specific about the type of microphone it is. I'm just going to come up with a few random letters and numbers here. Let's say a Sony X400 microphone. And then we need to make the point that it was sold at the manager's store. So which I purchased from your store, and again, very important that we give sufficient detail. So let's give that here, Tuesday the 24th of May. Okay. Something that you may be querying here is the use of the relative pronoun which. You might argue, well, do we not need a comma here because it's not essential to the sentence? Actually, in this case, it is, because we are not talking about any old Sony X400 microphone that I could have picked up anywhere. It's actually essential to the point of not just the sentence, but the entire letter, that we define this microphone as one that was purchased in the store. So it's crucial to that definition. It does define the microphone. So it makes it a defining relative clause rather than a non-defining clause where that information is less essential to the sentence. So it is essential, we don't use a comma, it's a defining relative clause in that case. Okay, let's go into the paragraph on describing the problem. Now, you'll have seen a lot of paragraphs begin like this by now, or similar to this. The reason is that the problem with the microphone is that the suggestion is that the whatever it is that it makes a very clear purpose for the paragraph itself. There's no ambiguity, there's a very clear sense of coherence and cohesion and of task achievement here. You're describing the problem immediately off the bat. So the problem with the microphone is that, and I've got some language to help me come up with some ideas here, it appears, this is what it seems like, it appears to cut out. Now you may be concerned that I'm using a phrasal verb here, but don't feel that just because it's a phrasal verb it's inappropriate from a formal letter. It's all context dependent. Some phrasal verbs will be inappropriate, some phrasal verbs are perfectly fine. They describe the problem accurately. So don't just immediately discount all phrasal verbs. Some of them are perfectly fine to include in a formal letter. Okay, cut out, and there's that language again, at random intervals. I'm going through it quite quickly, but I'm sure I'll think of something else. At random intervals when it is being used. Notice the grammar I'm using here again. So we have the present continuous, but in the passive voice. And rather than saying when I am using it, which would be the present continuous in the active voice, I'm using the passive voice here because I want the focus to be on the microphone itself. That is the central focus of this sentence and of this letter. So consider things like that when you're thinking about whether to use active or passive. So when it is being used. Okay, as I said earlier, maybe we can talk about the frequency, the duration of these interruptions. So we could say these interruptions. How about we show a little bit of word formation play instead? So we can turn, not all the time, but with quite a few phrasal verbs, we can turn them into nouns by just joining them together. And then they will, if we want to turn them into the plural, they will just have an S on the end, the usual plural S. So these cutouts can last for, nice expression, as long as, so up to, I don't know, 5 seconds at a time. And when I say at a time, what I mean is that each time it happens, they can last up to 5 seconds. Although, a bit more information, they usually last for around 2 seconds. So each time they happen, they can last up to 5 seconds, but the majority of times, the cutouts will last for around 2 seconds. And notice we've got a complex sentence in there as well. We've got that subordinating conjunction, linking the dependent clause with the independent clause, improving grammatical complexity. Of course, a very important part of your band score. Now, we can move into explaining how the problem is affecting our work. A nice way to open a paragraph like this is using the considering that structure. So considering that basically means this fact that I'm about to give you is important to the judgment of, well, in this case, the problem. It's important that we consider what I'm about to say in order to come up with an appropriate and accurate judgment. You'll see what I mean when I put this out here. Considering that I work as an online English teacher, as my plan suggests. And in this case, if you're using a considering that, when you come to the end of that clause, you want to introduce a comma here, and then we can say why we need to consider that. Considering that I work as an online English teacher, and then I said that it should be obvious what the problem is. So I'm going to say, I'm sure you can appreciate. And when I say appreciate here, I mean the verb in the sense of fully understand or to grasp the importance of something, not appreciate as in I appreciate a good song, not like. So yes, I am sure you can appreciate how important a functioning microphone is to my work. If we were to restructure that, a functioning microphone is important to my work. Notice we slightly change the structure there. It's necessary, but that's essentially what that part of the sentence is trying to say. I am sure you can appreciate how important to my work a functioning microphone is. However you want to structure that there. The important thing is you can see, again, we've got a complexity to the sentence there. And we can then move on to the next sentence. And I'm going to use another complex sentence here. I'm going to start with a since, which I mean in terms of duration here. Since purchasing the microphone. You could also say since I purchased the microphone. Either one is acceptable. The important thing is we have some complexity here. Since I purchased the microphone, or since purchasing the microphone, what's happened? Well, I think we've got this big problem here. So I imagine that the work has diminished in quality, as we put here. The quality has been compromised. Let's be more specific. I have not had a single call. We see a Skype call. We don't really need to say that. That should be implied. Which has been free of. Now, just before we carry on, I want to again draw your attention to this relative pronoun, a defining relative pronoun like we had above, and it's defining because this should be clearer to see. It is absolutely essential to the idea of a single call, because of course we've had a single call. We've had many calls, but we've had no calls which have been free of, and here's some paraphrasing, dropouts. Again, you could use interruptions if you want to, but dropouts is a little bit more specific really than interruptions. You could be interrupted by a friend, but dropouts is specific to a microphone picking up noise. To drop free of these dropouts. Yes, so let's go with these dropouts in fact. So to improve the referencing, improve the coherence and cohesion, we're referring back to the cutouts that we mentioned earlier. Free of these dropouts. Add a little bit more to bring in the idea from the plan, and this is compromising the quality of my lessons. Okay, so we got some nice sentences here, two nice sentences in this paragraph in terms of complexity and in terms of vocabulary as well. And let's finish with the fourth paragraph. So what do we want the shop or the manager to do? Now, we've had a look at a structure like this before. I'm going to use it again. And this is the conditional with the word should. And when we use should, we need to make sure that we are in the subjunctive mood. Should the problem be a defect? So in other words, if you wanted to use it with the standard if the problem is a defect. Should the problem be a defect? So we must use the infinitive there. Or if the problem is a defect. Now, if you were to follow with that, you're typically looking, hopefully you can see this, at the first conditional. If the problem is a defect, I will want this to happen, or zero conditional, I want this to happen. If the problem is a defect, I want this to happen. But be careful, look at what I'm going to do here. Okay, I'm going to put this all the way through before I talk about it, but just notice that you're probably wondering about the would. I would be grateful if you could rectify, basically fix or solve, nice verb to use that, this issue by, and then we'll come to that in a moment, but I want you to notice that this would, I would be grateful. First of all, it's more of that polite would, but secondly, you're actually following on from this side here. If you could rectify the problem, I would be grateful. So this is actually separated from this because this would is more influenced by the if you could part of the sentence here. So should the problem be a defect, if the item is defective, I'd be grateful if you could rectify it by providing me, as the plan says, with a refund, and then some just general nice template letter language, particularly when we're asking for a refund, at your earliest opportunity. So it sounds a bit weird, but a lot of letter language does sound a bit weird. So at your earliest opportunity. So we've got that second conditional, but also a polite request as well. Whenever we're requesting something, particularly in these conditions, particularly in formal and professional conditions, we should try to use more second conditional language because it suggests that we're not absolutely certain it will happen. It just sounds more polite, basically. Okay, now let's create another conditional. This is always useful when we're asking someone to do something. If we use these conditionals, because it does sound a little bit less forceful. Remember, we're not in a complaint letter here. We don't want to be too assertive, too aggressive. We just want to ask for some help. So ask for guidance if it's not a defect. If it's not a defect, we could say that it might be a case of what we can call user error. So the user, myself, doing something wrong. If you believe it is a simple case, and when I say it, I mean the problem, and that should be clear, that should be implied. You really should be able to understand that. If you believe it is a simple case of user error. Now notice when we start with the if clause, we do want that comma here. You'll notice up here that we didn't use a comma before the if clause. When it's in that order, you don't need one, but if you start with the if, please use the comma when you get to the end of the clause. If you believe it is a simple case of user error, I would appreciate, and again, similar to before, we're using would here to indicate a polite expression of a desire. It is not the second conditional. It should really be in that zero conditional. If you think it's my problem, then please guide me. You can see the guide there in the present simple to create this two-sided zero conditional there. So this would appreciate, you can imagine paraphrasing to I want, but want is too abrupt. It's a bit rude. It's not polite and it's not formal, therefore the tone would be inappropriate. Would appreciate is the correct way to go. I would appreciate some guidance. And notice the verb appreciate here, a different meaning to the verb appreciate above. This appreciate that we had up here, this appreciate is I would like. I would like some guidance on how to fix the issue, resolve the issue. A few different verbs you could have here. Just make sure you don't repeat verbs like rectify. So yeah, that should be fine there. And then let's close it up with something polite, something to show that we're being polite, so they may speed up their response. Thank you for your cooperation. Nice and simple. Again, sort of a template sentence that you can use in any request for help letters, because this is providing information, but it is also, should really add this to the plan, request for help. So both important here. And then we close off. Now, how should we close off? Well, it's a formal letter, so it should be a yours, then what? Well, we've got a sir or madam, so we don't know the name, and in these cases, we go with a faithfully, not a sincerely, and then formal letter, so a full name is important. Let's come up with a name here. Say Julia Parker, something like that. And then we can see there's a word count here, 175, so it's just getting towards being on the long side, but I think that's perfectly okay. There should be enough time there to go back and check your work, look for any errors. Of course, I'm hoping that there are none in this case, but there we go. So we have a formal letter here, which has a dual purpose of providing information and requesting help, with a possibility, if you wanted to include it, of introducing a complaint, but that is certainly not the primary or even secondary purpose here. So you really need to be careful to think about whether you should include that or not. I personally do not think it's appropriate, but some of the language at the bottom there can be leaning towards it just a little bit. Anyway, some nice language in this sentence in terms of those purposes, and in terms of your work, and in terms of equipment, in terms of writing to a shop, and in terms of requesting help. Hopefully you found that useful, and you can have a look at the gap fill exercises now. And as always, I will look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.